In 1908, every tunnel through Donner Pass became a death trap, choking Southern Pacific crews with so much smoke that men staggered off trains simply to breathe. Faced with bankruptcy and tragedy on the same rails, the railroad did something no one dared try. They built locomotives to run backwards across the Sierra, an act so desperate it looked insane. But could this backwards engine really save both lives and a company? The answer begins where suffocation met stubbornness, and every mile carried a wager with fate. At 7,000 feet above sea level, the Sierra Nevada rises like a wall between California and the rest of the country. For 40 miles, Southern Pacific's main line burrowed through a labyrinth of wooden snow sheds and 39 tunnels, each one trapping more danger than it kept out. In winter, snow buried the tracks so deep that only these sheds kept the railroad moving. But inside, the air turned deadly. When the new mallet locomotives arrived in 1908, they were the biggest engines anyone had ever seen west of the Rockies. Their exhaust poured out in thick, rolling clouds, filling every enclosed space with smoke and soot. The sheds and tunnels became ovens, hot, airless, and black as pitch. Engineers tried to shield their faces with wet rags, but the smoke seeped into everything. Some wore crude respirators, hoping to filter out the worst of it. Others simply held their breath and prayed for daylight at the end of each tunnel. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Men stumbled from their cabs, faces streaked with black, eyes red and watering, lungs burning from the chemical assault. Some collapsed beside the tracks, coughing up blood. A few never made it out at all. The combination of carbon monoxide, heat, and exhaustion left crews half-conscious at their posts. Stories spread of engineers passing out at the throttle, trains careening forward in darkness while brakemen pounded on the cab, desperate to wake the man at the controls. The mallet's power came at a terrible cost. Their exhaust velocity was so fierce that it tore at the snowshed roofs, sending splinters and boards crashing down onto the tracks. Maintenance crews raced to patch holes, but the damage kept coming. Southern Pacific's operating costs soared. Every mile over Donner Pass became a gamble. Would the crew make it through, or would another man be lost to the mountain? By the end of each run, the men looked more like miners than railroaders, their uniforms stained with soot, their hands trembling from fatigue. The railroad handed out extra pay for those willing to face the sheds, but no amount of money could buy a safe breath. The mountain demanded its price, and every train that passed through Donner Pass paid in sweat, blood, and sometimes lives. One day, a crew reached the turntable at the base of the mountain and did something nobody had tried before. The engineer spun his mallet locomotive around so that the tender, normally trailing behind, now faced forward. He coupled the tender to the head of the train, leaving the massive boiler and smokestacks trailing at the rear. When the train started up the grade, the difference was immediate. The thick black exhaust poured out behind the crew instead of suffocating them in the cab. For the first time, the engineer could breathe as he guided the train through the pitch-black sheds. But this desperate workaround brought its own set of dangers. The tender, never designed to lead a train, blocked nearly all forward visibility. The engineer sat on the left side of the cab, but Southern Pacific signals were placed on the right. To see the track ahead, he had to lean out the window, straining for a glimpse past the oil tank and water bunker. At every crossing and curve, he was blind to what lay ahead. Brakemen were forced to ride the footboards or stand atop the tender, shouting warnings or signaling with lanterns through the swirling snow. In the tunnels, the echo of the engine's chuffing bounced off granite walls, making it nearly impossible to hear anything else. Running tender first also meant the locomotive's pilot wheels, built to guide the engine smoothly over switches and curves, were now at the back. The heavy tender took every blow from rough track or fallen debris. Any derailment could send thousands of gallons of oil and water tumbling down the mountainside. Speed had to be kept low. On a good day, a train might crawl at 15 miles per hour, inching through the sheds and tunnels, every crew member on edge. Still, more and more engineers followed this example. The alternative was choking on exhaust, or worse. Crews weighed their odds: risk a collision with a stray wagon or a stalled train, or risk not making it through alive at all. The railroad's operating manual did not mention this method, but nobody stopped the practice. Southern Pacific's managers saw what was happening and understood the message. The men would rather face the unknown dangers of running backwards than another trip through the mountain the old way. The hack kept trains moving, but it was a gamble with every mile. The company needed a real solution, something engineered, not improvised, before luck ran out. In the spring of 1909, Southern Pacific's mechanical department drafted a set of blueprints that broke every rule of American locomotive design. The plan called for a mallet engine with the cab pushed all the way to the very front, perched above the pilot, while the boiler and smokestack trailed behind. Instead of coal, the locomotive would burn oil, piped from the tender at the rear, routed through insulated lines running the full length of the machine. The firebox would sit directly behind the crew, fed by pressurized oil forced forward by 5 pounds of air pressure in the cylindrical tank. Every control, every linkage, every gauge had to be reimagined and reversed. The engineer's valves and levers, normally built for a right-hand cab, were mirrored for the left. The Walschaerts valve gear, Johnson bar, and reversing rods all had to operate in the opposite direction, yet feel familiar to a man trained on standard engines. No other railroad had ever attempted anything like it. There was no prototype, no trial run, no small-scale test. Southern Pacific did not hedge its bets. The order, placed with Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, called for 15 locomotives at once, numbers 4002 through 4016. The contract specified a delivery window of just 6 weeks, from February to March 1910. Shop draftsmen at Baldwin pored over plumbing diagrams and mechanical drawings, trying to anticipate every stress and failure point. They debated the risks of running hot oil lines through a moving, articulated frame, and the hazards of placing the crew in front of 30 feet of boiler and machinery. The tender, now trailing behind the smokestack, would have to carry enough oil and water to climb 40 miles of steep grade without a refill. The design called for a 288 two-wheel arrangement, with the massive boiler segmented into 2 articulated sections to handle the sharp curves and heavy grades of the Sierra. The high-pressure cylinders sat closest to the cab, driving the forward set of 8 drivers. The low-pressure cylinders powered the rear. Steam exhausted from the rear of the locomotive, venting into the snow sheds and tunnels far behind the crew. Every detail was scrutinized for reliability under mountain conditions. The pressurized oil system had to work in sub-zero weather, so the pipes were wrapped with steam lines to keep the fuel from congealing. The water feed was fitted with a Worthington heater, ensuring the boiler would not run dry on the long climb. The articulated boiler sections were essential to make the engine negotiate tight mountain curves while still delivering enormous tractive effort. Baldwin's shop floor became a laboratory of improvisation. Crews assembled the first frames upside down, routing the piping and linkages before flipping the structure upright. The cab, a boxy structure with wide windows on both sides, was bolted to the front pilot, giving the engineer an unobstructed view of both rails. By the end of March 1910, all 15 MC2 class cab forwards stood ready for delivery. Lined up in the Philadelphia yard, strange reversed giants waiting for the journey west. There was no time for test runs or fine-tuning. The railroad's crisis in the mountains demanded immediate action. Each unit was shipped as soon as it cleared inspection, still bearing the chalk marks of the draftsmen who had gambled their reputations on a blueprint that defied a century of locomotive tradition. The day the first cab forward locomotives arrived, the Roseville yard fell silent. Crews gathered in small knots, staring at machines that looked like nothing they'd ever seen. The cab perched at the very front, jutting out over the rails, with 30 feet of boiler and firebox trailing behind. Some men spat tobacco and shook their heads. Others just stood with arms crossed, refusing to move. Word spread fast. Nobody wanted to be the first to take one up the mountain. For years, every engineer on the Sierra Run had lived with the same calculation: smoke or collision, suffocation or derailment. Now the railroad was asking them to climb into a cab with nothing but thin steel and glass between them and the open track. The old mallets had at least given a sense of protection. In the cab forwards, the crew would be the first to meet anything on the rails: a runaway wagon, a rock slide, a stalled freight, even a snowplow coming the other way. The fear was not just talk. On Donner Pass, blind curves and hidden crossings were a fact of life. If something was on the tracks, the engineer would see it a split second before impact. There was no buffer, no time to jump. The men called it riding in the coffin. Rumors of a standoff reached the division office by noon. Yard foremen reported that crews assigned to the new engines left their names off the call board. Some firemen threatened to quit outright. Others demanded written guarantees, or at least hazard pay. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, already battered by years of accident reports and funerals, sent a telegram to Sacramento asking for clarification. No reply came. Instead, management sent a superintendent down to the yard. He listened to the complaints, then pointed up at the white line of snow sheds on the mountainside. He did not shout. He just asked a question. Which death would you rather face, the one you can see coming, or the one that creeps up behind you in the dark? The answer came slowly. One by one, engineers signed on for the run. Some did it out of pride, unwilling to let another man take the risk first. Others did it for the overtime, or because they had families to feed. Most just wanted to get it over with. As the sun set behind the yard, the first cab forward rolled toward the base of the pass. The crew inside checked their watches, adjusted their caps, and stared straight ahead. Every man knew what was at stake. There were no guarantees, only the hope that this strange machine, built in a Philadelphia shop and shipped across the continent, would do what the blueprints promised. That night, the telegraph wires buzzed with updates. The locomotive made it through the sheds, running strong. The crew stepped down at the summit, faces pale, but breathing easy. They did not say much, but word spread that the forward cab gave a view of the rails no standard engine could match. The next morning, a second crew took the same engine up the grade, then a third. The tension did not vanish overnight, but the gamble had been made. Southern Pacific had forced the issue. The men would ride at the front, with nothing between them and the mountain but their own nerve, and the promise of a clear breath at the end of the tunnel. The cab forward's locomotives settled into the mountain runs as if they had been built for nothing else. Crews who once dreaded the call board now boasted about their assignments. The cab, perched at the very front, offered a sweeping panoramic view of the rails and the landscape beyond. For the first time, engineers could see both sides of the track at once: signals, switches, and approaching hazards, all within easy sight. Brakemen leaned from the wide cab windows, confident they could spot a stray wagon or a fallen tree long before it became a crisis. The signature sound of the cab forwards, a sharp, echoing wheeze as steam exhausted straight into the open air, became as much a part of the Sierra as the snow and granite. Passengers waiting at the summit learned to listen for that whistle and wheeze, knowing it meant another train had climbed the long grade without a hitch. Mechanical logs from the era show a steady drop in lost time and emergency stops. The pressurized oil and water systems, once a gamble on the drawing board, proved reliable even in the worst winter storms. Frozen pipes and fuel starvation became rare events. Maintenance crews learned the quirks of the reversed plumbing, swapping stories about the time-saving tricks needed to keep the engines running through a Sierra blizzard. Southern Pacific's roster of cab forwards grew quickly. The first MC2 class engines gave way to newer, more powerful designs. The two 882 locomotives were joined by 4 662 locomotives, and then the massive 4882 locomotives, machines that dwarfed anything else on the rails. By 1944, the railroad owned 256 cab-forward locomotives, more than any other single class of mountain engine in North America. Nowhere else did such a fleet exist. Other railroads watched with curiosity, but none dared copy the experiment. For Southern Pacific's crews, the cab forwards became a point of pride, a symbol of mastery over a route that had once seemed unbeatable. The gamble had paid off. The railroad was no longer at the mercy of the mountain. The men in the cab had claimed the high ground, and the line through Donner Pass became the most reliable artery in the West. After December 7, 1941, the Southern Pacific Main Line became a lifeline for the nation at war. Overnight, the railroad's schedule filled with troop trains, ammunition cars, and endless lines of tanks and trucks bound for Pacific ports. The traffic was relentless. In a single year, the volume of freight crossing the Sierra doubled. By the next year, it had tripled. Every siding overflowed with military hardware. Every timetable groaned under the weight of new priorities. The snow sheds that once threatened to choke the railroad now echoed with the thunder of war. Dispatchers in Sacramento and Sparks worked around the clock, shuffling consists and assigning motive power with military precision. Conventional locomotives could not keep up. Only the cab forwards, now 256 strong, could muscle the longest, heaviest trains up the 2.2% grades without stopping for breath. They ran day and night, their distinctive exhaust trailing behind like a battle flag. The crews who once hesitated to climb into those forward cabs now took pride in their role. They knew that every load delivered to the docks meant another chance for victory overseas. The numbers tell the story. In 1942 alone, Southern Pacific moved more than 2 million tons of military freight over Donner Pass. Some trains stretched nearly 2 miles from engine to caboose, their cargo classified and their schedules secret. There were no breaks for weather or fatigue. The cab forwards pressed through blizzards and blackouts, their oil-fired boilers immune to the worst the mountain could throw at them. On some days, a single cab forward hauled more tonnage in one trip than the entire line had managed in a week before the war. Rail historians and logistics planners would later study the records and marvel at the scale. David P. Morgan, editor of Trains magazine, put it simply: without the cab forwards, Southern Pacific would have broken under its immense war load. The railroad that once teetered on the edge of bankruptcy became the backbone of the Pacific supply line. The backwards locomotive, born from desperation, had become the engine of victory. Innovation rarely looks right at first glance. Today, number 4294 stands silent, but its legacy endures in every industry, forced to rethink the impossible. As climate and infrastructure crises demand new answers, history proves that yesterday's desperation can become tomorrow's blueprint. Sometimes the solution we need is the one that looks backward until it moves us forward. What do you see when you face the impossible?